Billy and Lord Byron, or A Matter of Time, by William Ross Dodd Jr., illustrations by Alma Margaret Stye. It was very hot and humid. The sweat rolled down his arms onto his hands as he leaned the brush hook against the oak tree. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead, the back of his neck, and his hands. He stretched, took a deep breath, and listened to the noisy silence of the woods. The sun was well past its peak, and from the angle of the shadows, he felt it must be near 3 o'clock. North of him, through the deep second growth underbrush, he could hear the steady, rhythmical thunk of Joe's brush hook. They were to be working toward each other, cutting a swath along the easement so that a dredge would be able to come and deepen the stream that gurgled to the east. The stream would then be able to carry off the lowland water and enable the bulldozer and other earth-moving equipment to prepare the land for industrial development. It was Billy's second summer working for this construction company, and he liked the work. It was a pleasant change from school, and the physical nature of the work, clearing land, digging ditches, and laying sewer lines, appealed to him. It was hard work, but it paid well, and perhaps more important to someone interested in athletics, it was a good conditioner. He leaned back against the tree, having decided to take a break. He didn't feel guilty that Joe was still working, because he had worked construction long enough to know that, over the days and weeks, the breaks evened out. Soon, however, Billy became aware of an additional reason for pausing to listen. While he had been working, he had sensed a more than normal level of crow noise in the woods, and had, he now realized, half-consciously made a note of it. Now he looked above and in the direction of the natural clearing some 200 yards away. He could hear Joe steadily hacking away. He could also see and hear, in the breezy and sun-dappled green of the treetops, a great deal of swirling and raucous activity on the part of the crows. This in itself wasn't unusual, for the crows had been noisy ever since the men had begun work in this section the previous week, as if they were establishing their rights to the property. But at the moment, the boy noted, there was a certain almost frantic quality to their cawing. While he watched, they rose, flapping in a loose circle and glistening in the sun, only to plunge down and flutter over an area not far from where Billy estimated that Joe was working. The crows repeated this wild flight cycle again and again. He smiled to think of the contrast between the birds and Joe, who was stodly and methodically working along, either ignoring the noise or, more likely, accepting it impatiently. Joe disliked crows, said they were no damn good. Billy recalled how futile his efforts had been to explain to him how beautiful and intelligent they were. Just yesterday, sitting at the foot of the massive sycamore tree, eating their lunch in its shade, they had had another argument about the crows. Afterward, Billy had decided to say no more on the subject, because it did no good and was a source of friction between the schoolboy and the laborer. Any arrogance on his part could well destroy the good relationship they had developed over the past 2 summers. Besides, the boy had the good sense to realize that Joe's experience hadn't exactly prepared him to be a nature lover. He had been in Nazi prison camps for 6 years and had been forced to devote all his energies to staying alive. Billy therefore could understand how the admiration of pests, such as crows, might strike Joe as frivolous. Suddenly, he heard Joe's heavy accented cry, "Billy, Billy!" Startled out of his reverie, he jumped, listened. The crows seemed to be going crazy, and heard Joe call again. He quickly picked up his brush hook and made his way as rapidly as he could through the underbrush. Joe called twice more while the boy made his way, and Billy yelled in response, "I'm coming, I'm coming. Are you all right?" Soon he burst into a small clearing and saw Joe standing over something in the underbrush at the base of the swamp maple. The crows were cawing and fluttering wildly overhead. In fact, some were coming quite close to Joe as they swooped down. He saw him immediately and called out, "Hey, look at this, Bill, one of your friends." The last was said with something like a smirk on his face. The boy couldn't see what he was gesturing at with his brush hook until he was nearly next to him. There, flapping in the underbrush, was a young crow. About half grown, Billy guessed. He clearly could not fly, but it was not for lack of trying. His bright, beady eyes were frantic as he banged into the brush. Just then, Joe took a swipe with his brush hook at one particularly daring adult who swooped overhead. Although he missed the bird by a wide margin, his enthusiasm was upsetting to Billy, who by now was concerned for the panicky crow on the ground. Hey, Beale, what do you think? His response was automatic. Well, we've got to see if we can help the bird. He deliberately avoided the word crow. Help him? Are you crazy? Help him? Joe was incredulous. Hey, look, Beale, we got work to do. Jackson will be back soon, and how are we going to tell him we ain't finished the day's work? Let's just give him a crack, he said, pointing toward the bird. He's no good in the first place anyway. We'll be doing him a favor. Out of his misery. He looked expectantly at the boy. Billy couldn't speak. Joe nodded as if his silence was to be taken as approval. A breeze through the grove felt chill on his bare skin, though it must have been 95 in the shade. The shadows, the wild cawing of the crows, the helplessness of the injured bird, and the look on Joe's face all served to keep him from speaking. Joe started to move towards the bird, and Billy said, faintly at first, "Don't do anything, Joe. I mean it. He didn't do anything to you." Joe looked at him sideways with an ironic smile. Okay, smart guy, what are you going to do? Billy hadn't had any ideas and didn't have any now, but the sarcastic tone of Joe's voice and his own feeling of silliness at getting so involved that he couldn't speak, he felt very young and vulnerable, forced him into a decision. I'll take care of the bird. I know birds, and I'll fix him up, he said with bravado. Besides, he continued, growing more sure as he spoke, I know what is the matter with him. I'll bet he flew into a tree or something while he was learning to fly and got a concussion. I'll bet that's it. Ah, laughed Joe. You're really dope of a kid. What are you going to do when Jackson come around? Billy hadn't thought of that. He checked his pocket watch. 3:10. What was he going to do for the next hour and a half until quitting time? Go back to work? Leave the crow here alone, near where Joe was working? Joe was laughing out loud now, and the boy blushed. He was no longer as worried for the crow as he was annoyed at Joe and embarrassed for himself. He blurted out, I'll take him right now and bring him home. They looked at one another for a long time. You're nuts. I'm not going to cover for you. He turned away. Picking up his brush hook, he went back to work. The crows were still whirling overhead. Billy looked at the crow. It had all sounded so simple and correct before. He had all the answers. He knew all about birds. After all, didn't he say he did? The boy felt more than a little silly as he remembered his brave words, for although it was true that he had always loved birds and had spent much time watching and reading about them, it was also true that he was no specialist in the care and feeding of sick ones. In addition, what would Jackson say if he came around? Billy thought of the foreman with distaste. He was a harsh man who always spoke roughly to him and made it clear that he didn't think much of summer help. It would be great if he lost his job, he thought ruefully, over a crow. He looked down at the pathetic flapping of the bird with something less than affection. What a fine fix his big mouth had gotten him into. Well, it was too late now. He had made his stand. The crows, about 10 to 12 of them, were, if anything, louder than before. Joe kept working, his back to the boy. Well, I'd better get started, he said half aloud, and squatted down next to the crow, who was at the moment quiet, his head cocked to one side as he gazed at the boy balefully. Billy gingerly extended his hand. The crow cawed, lunged forward, and gave him a sharp nip on the forefinger. This drove the crows above into an even greater frenzy. He knew Joe was watching him out of the corner of his eye. Made bold by that fact, he moved quickly, if clumsily, and surrounded the bird with his hands. Although one wing flapped free and the crow was darting his head wildly about. He stood and with a quick motion, smoothed the errant wing in against the wild body. All the while, he spoke softly and rapidly to the bird. It's all right. I'll take care of you. Everything will be all right. This seemed to quiet its struggling somewhat, although shock or fright were really the more likely reason. Joe turned around, looked at Billy with a wry expression, probably wondering what he would do next. What of his brush hook, his lunchbox, the foreman? The boy had his hands full in more ways than one. His car was about a half mile through the woods, and it was clear that he'd have to get his equipment later on. He turned and started for the car, to the chorus of caws and a derisive look from Joe. Only the crows followed as he made his way clumsily through the thick underbrush. Because both hands were occupied, and because he had to keep an eye on the crow's darting beak, it was very difficult to make his way over the uneven and tangled terrain. He kept talking to the bird softly and rapidly, but beneath the glistening softness of the feathers, the crow's heart pounded wildly. As he moved farther and farther from the clearing, some of the pursuers began to give up the chase. Still, by the time he reached the shoulder of the road where his car was parked, there were two big males in swirling and noisy attendance. With some difficulty, he freed his right hand by pressing the crow to his chest with his left. He groped for his keys, and after dropping them once, finally opened the car door. A blast of hot air hit him, for the car had been locked up in the sun all day. Billy knew he couldn't open the windows very wide and resigned himself to a hot trip. Not that that's a big problem, he thought ruefully. He laid the bird down gently on the front seat and started the car. The crow, though quiet, lay awkwardly on one side, the opposite wing spread for balance. Billy wondered why it didn't stand or perch, and it was then that he noticed that the right foot and leg were bloody. The leg feathers were matted down with it, and the foot seemed contorted as well. He looked at his left hand and saw a little blood on it. Oh, great, he's got a bum leg too. Now the boy began to wonder just what he was going to do. Was he going to simply arrive home early with the injured bird? Surely there would be questions from his well-meaning but concerned grandparents, who were staying with the family while his parents were in Europe on business. They had a big job, and Billy knew that it wasn't fair to worry them. What was he going to do? For an instant, he thought of leaving the bird in the woods, going back to work, and telling Joe that the crow had been only momentarily stunned, and given the opportunity, had flown off with the adults. He knew immediately, however, that would be both ridiculous and cruel. Joe wouldn't believe him in the first place, and the bird would be worse off than when he was found. As he sat watching the crow, Billy realized that he would have to do what he could. It was then that he thought of the veterinarians. There were two of them on the way home. That's it, he said aloud. I'll have the bird examined and get some recommendations from the vet.
Relieved by having decided on a specific course of action, the boy eagerly put the car into gear and started off. He drove as carefully as he could in order to protect the frightened bird. The old Ford inched forward, and by shifting smoothly, Billy soon got up to speed. He talked constantly, consoling himself as much or more than the crow by the sound of his voice. It's all right. Everything's going to be all right. We're going to have you fixed up in no time at all. Each time they rounded a curve, no matter how gentle and no matter how carefully he drove, the car heeled over somewhat. Yet the bird would instinctively and skillfully use his wings and one good leg to maintain his balance. In a short while, they moved out onto Maple Avenue and headed north in the direction of the veterinarians. When he arrived at the first of the two animal hospitals, he turned into a gravel lot and came gently to a halt. He left the crow in the seat, got out, and walked up to the door of what was an office extension of a large white frame house. He rang the bell. There was no answer. The small, neatly lettered sign on the door told him why. The posted office hours were Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Afternoons 2 to 4, evenings 6 to 8. Today was Thursday. Billy walked back towards the car and looked up at the house. He went back and rang the front doorbell of the house itself. In a moment, he heard a window opening upstairs. He stepped down off the concrete stoop and looked up. He saw the tousled head and irritated face of a man he correctly took to be the doctor. What do you want? Doctor, I have an injured crow in my car. I found him in the woods about a half hour ago. It was then that Billy realized that he didn't present a very gracious appearance, covered as he was with sweat and dirt. Where I was working, he finished lamely. Listen, son, the doctor said gruffly. I was sleeping. I don't have office hours today, and besides, my practice is devoted to household pets. A crow is a varmint. Not good for much. Doctor, please. The poor thing has a concussion, I think. And his leg is hurt. I just want someone to tell me what to do with him. I'll tell you what to do with him. He said this angrily and slammed the window. Billy stood there for what seemed a long time, and then slowly turned. He was not so much angry as upset. His boots crunched across the hot gravel, and when he had almost reached the car, he heard the same gruff voice again, but now from the office doorway. All right, bring the bird in here. No point in letting something God made die, is there? No, sir. Yes, sir, said the boy in enthusiastic confusion. He quickly opened the front door and with little effort gathered up the crow. The bird was quiet, probably exhausted, Billy thought. As he passed into the cool interior of the office, he could hear the dogs in the kennel in the back and could smell the familiar dog odor. The doctor, a burly middle-aged man, opened his way into the examining room, flicked on the lights, and said, Bring him over to the table. Billy did as he was told. The doctor instructed him how to hold the glove, and then proceeded to give him a thorough examination. He gently manipulated his wings and checked the damaged leg and foot. He then picked up a little flashlight, and after holding the bird's beak closed, he examined the eyes and ear vents. The boy felt greatly encouraged by his apparent competence. After he finished putting the light away, he turned back to Billy and said, Well, what's the matter, doctor? I thought maybe he had a concussion. Finding the way we did, flopping along. I didn't think that he had a broken wing because he could flex them both. He'd even start to fly, then skim off at a crazy angle and crash. The doctor said nothing, and the boy went nervously on. Well, I don't really know, but I've read how important balance is to flying, and that a sense of balance can be upset by a hard crack on the head. Oh, is that so? Said the doctor, laughing at the boy's look of embarrassed worry. He clapped a large hand on Billy's shoulder. That's a very good diagnosis, young man. I believe that this varmint flew into a tree or some such, and upset the sense of balance in the inner ear. Without the proper functioning of the inner ear, a bird doesn't have a chance of flying. As for the foot and leg, it's hard to say. That's a pretty nasty cut there. He might have been jumped by a cat. But then why didn't the cat or it ever finish him off? His voice trailed off. Billy quickly broke in and told him of the adult crows who were protecting him, and the doctor nodded. Fair enough. In any case, the foot may be deformed a little, but nothing really serious will result from that. He'll soon be able to perch. What about the balance in the flying, doctor? Well, that's another thing. In most cases like this one, if the bird is given a chance, it will heal. It's just a matter of time, that's all. It's like a concussion in a human. The problem is that, in the wild, they're not usually given the chance. A cat, a dog, or something will get them first. About how long does the healing take? It all depends how serious the concussion is. I'd say several weeks at the outside in this particular case, no more. Billy frowned. The doctor continued in a kindly but stern manner. Your instincts were right, son, but you've gotten yourself an inconvenience now. Do you think your folks are going to want this varmint around? If you decide to go to the trouble of caring for him? Who will care for him when you're at work? Well, that's up to you. I'll do it somehow, doctor. Good enough. There's still another problem. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the crow is a very intelligent critter, and they're very clannish. They stick together, post sentries while they're robbing some farmer's grain, and so on. Once one is separated from the clan, he runs the very real risk of being ostracized, outcast for the rest of his days. He might be a loner. Not always, you understand, but often. You'll have to think of that if you care for him, and then decide to let him go. And he'll want to go because he's a wild thing. This is true even though you'll hear that some people have had luck training them. They're as smart as a whip. Billy had been listening intently, and his expression was now one of worried concern. The doctor's voice is softened. Nothing's easy, son. Everything has its pros and cons, its pluses and minuses. Any decision you make, you'll find that it's that way. After a long silence, the boy spoke. Thanks, doctor. I'll be taking them along now. We'll do all right. How much do I owe you? Would you bill me? I only have $1 with me now. The doctor laughed. Listen here, young man. I've told you before, My practice is devoted to domestic animals and household pets. A crow is a varmint, no charge. Thank you, doctor. Billy smiled. He showed him to the door and watched as the boy made his way with the bird across the parking lot. Just as he was about to get in the car, the doctor shouted out, "Son!" The boy turned around. The man grinned. I'd have done the same thing. The door closed. He got in the car and laid the crow on the front seat. He felt strangely elated. Well, whatever the problems, he'd worked them out. The reason he felt so good was the doctor. He had seemed so grumpy and unconcerned, but really he wasn't. He touched the crow gently with his thumb and forefinger, and then started the car. The crow spread his wings for balance, and they were off. Moving carefully and slowly, he made his way toward Ridgewood and home.
There was considerable traffic, but Billy knew that it was the normal amount for the end of the working day. It was this that struck him because it reminded him of the working day, and that, quite reasonably, reminded him of his own job, the one he had left with the crow. He quickly dismissed that thought, for he realized that tomorrow would be soon enough to think of that. In a short while, he came to a steep switchback turn that had to be made in order to get to the street on which he lived. In spite of the fact that he was driving as carefully as he could, the inevitable heeling over of the car forced the crow to roll off the front seat onto the floor. Billy took his eyes off the road as he reached for the crow with his right hand, and as a result, the car veered to the right side of the road and jumped the curb. Fortunately, it was moving very slowly and came to a halt without hitting anything. My God, this bird will be the death of me. With only a little trouble, he recovered the crow, whose pride seemed more injured than anything else. He petted and talked to him to quiet him down and placed him back on the front seat. He then gingerly backed the car off the sidewalk and drove the remaining few yards home without incident. At least I'm home at the normal time, he thought with relief. So for the moment, there'll be no questions on that account. As he drove into the driveway, he could see his grandmother in the kitchen, and when he pulled up to the garage, he saw his grandfather in the rose garden. He wasn't really too worried about their reaction, for they were kindly disposed toward animals of all kinds, the two-legged kind as well, he smiled. Nevertheless, he decided to get out by himself at first and pass the time of day. As he opened the door, he made a final cautionary gesture to the crow and whispered, "Be quiet now till I get the lay of the land." Now walking toward his grandfather, he called out, "Hiya, Pepas." The man smiled. He did often and easily. "Hello, Billy, a hot day. How was work?" "Fine, Pape. Dirty and sweaty. Nothing really new," he lied. "Except those crows I told you about really aren't pleased with us invading their domicile. They're a darn smart bird. They give some people fits, all right, but they're sure smart." "And pretty," Billy said, happy with any encouragement regarding crows. "Well, I suppose, providing they're not stealing your eggs or eating your seed crop," Pepas laughed. Just then, the crow cawed, not loud, but loud enough for the boy to hear. The man didn't seem to notice and continued to spray the roses. "Well, I'll see you in a little bit. I'd better go shower." "Okay, Billy." He turned and walked down the driveway to the house. When he entered the kitchen, his grandmother turned from the sink, dried her hands on her apron, and smiled. He walked over and kissed her cheek. "What's for dinner, Mama?" "Pork tenderloin, boiled potatoes, and bean salad." "Sounds good. How was work, Billy?" "I think it's too much, all that heavy work for a young boy. You look tired." "No, Mama, nothing a shower won't fix. You know those crows I told you about? They sure aren't happy with us being on their property. They're awful pests, Billy, but they sure are pretty, those black feathers and bright eyes and all." She wiped her upper lip and folded her hands in front of her. Billy paused for a moment and then blurted everything out. "I've got a crow. I got him today. He's about half grown. He's hurt and we've got to help him." His grandmother watched without changing her expression. Billy went on. "I left work early with him. One of the guys wanted to do him in. I've already been to the vets. He's got a concussion, but he'll soon be well if he can just get some protection and rest. He was just lying there, flopping around. A cat or something would have gotten him for sure." He stopped, out of breath. "Where is he? I mean now." "On the front seat of my car." She rubbed the bridge of her nose with her index finger, something she often did when she was thinking. After several moments, she took a breath and started for the back door. "Well, I guess we'd better go tell Pepas and then see the celebrity." They walked up the driveway without a word until Billy called out, Pape, I've got something to show you. Crouched in the garden, his grandfather looked up sideways and grinned. You mean that crow in the car? Billy looked shocked. Yes, sir. I'd have to be deaf not to hear him, or blind not to see him for that matter, with all that flopping around. I figured you'd be out in a moment. Relieved by their calm reception, he went on and told the whole story from the beginning. His grandfather interrupted first. Listen, son, he's going to need a cage, someplace to keep him safe. And a crow isn't a small bird. It'll have to be a pretty good sized cage. Got any ideas? No, I don't. Well, I do. Up in the loft over the garage, there's an old work table I gave your father a while back. If we took that, sank the legs into the ground, and got some of that extra screening, which is also up in the loft, and wrapped it tightly around the legs and nailed it into the legs to hold it, then you'd have yourself a proper cage, big enough and strong enough to keep him in, and such enemies as cats or squirrels out. Billy, I declare, his grandmother broke in. You knew what was the matter with him before you took him to the vets. That's a wonder. I really did, Mama, he said proudly. This happy interlude was interrupted by his grandfather. Listen, you two, we'd better get started, or else the inside of that car isn't going to look like much. Not that it does now. His grandmother went back into the house to delay dinner. In a short while, Pepas and Billy had all the materials assembled. They built the cage in a garden beneath a towering red oak immediately behind the house. They even made a door with the assistance of a pair of wire cutters and some loose strands of wire. In less than 30 minutes, the crow was taken from the car, irate and insulted. Billy calmed him down. What are you going to call him? After all, it looks as if he's going to be here for a while, and just Crow won't do. The sinking sun gleamed off his feathers. His heart beat wildly, and his bright head darted. After a moment, Billy said, He has a bad leg, and he's very handsome. I'm going to name him Lord Byron, after the wild, crippled, and handsome English poet. Quite a dignified name for a varmint, Pepas said wryly, but he's yours to name, I guess. The boy put Lord Byron in his cage and was pleased to see that the crow didn't seem to mind his new quarters. They went inside and ate. Conversation at the table consisted of little more than crow stories, conjectures, and plans. His grandmother recalled with sentimental approval all the stray animals that Billy and his brother were forever bringing home. They all laughed at the retelling of some of the stories, and the dinner hour passed happily. As soon as the dishes were done, Billy and Pepas went out to the backyard with some food for the new resident. They had gotten a meal that consisted of birdseed, some raw vegetables, and a bit of chopped meat. Lord Byron looked at them and then at the food with equal disinterest. Okay, you don't think anything will get him, do you? It'll take some getting used to, that's all. One thing's for sure, Pepas said. He's not going to start eating while we're watching him. I think maybe we ought to leave him alone for the night. If anything does, he'll let us know. Besides, we made the cage pretty solid, and I deliberately sank the wire into the ground so that nothing could dig its way under the mesh and get in that way. Billy reached in and touched the bird gently. Good night, Lord Byron. The crow did nothing but gaze fixedly at the boy. Billy slept well, and so apparently did the bird, for he seemed bright and alert in the morning. Most of the food was gone, and they all recognized that as a good sign. He had to rush for work as usual, and only had time for a quick goodbye, but he felt fine, for he knew that his grandparents would take good care of the crow. It wasn't until he was nearly at work that he began to think of what might greet him, and it was with more than a little nervousness that he parked his car on the shoulder of the road near the worksite. As he made his way through the underbrush, he became more and more nervous. His condition wasn't helped any when he spotted the foreman's Jeep through the trees. At least I'm not late this morning, he thought ironically. The foreman was walking toward the Jeep from the direction of the place where Joe had discovered Lord Byron. It was another humid morning, and the sweat was running down the foreman's face as Billy approached him. Morning, Mr. Jackson. Hi, kid. Listen, you and your buddy had better get cracking on clearing that strip. They want to bring that dredge in here before Christmas, you know. Okay, Billy said with great relief. Sure thing, we'll really step on it. The foreman looked at him skeptically, as if he suspected that such a cooperative remark had to be meant sarcastically. Ordinarily, he might have had reason, but not this morning, because the boy knew that the foreman must not know about yesterday. Well, I'd better get to work. See you later. He gunned the engine, put the Jeep into four-wheel drive, and turned back toward the road. Billy continued on to the work site. Joe must have covered for him after all. At the very least, he had not said anything. In a few moments, he arrived at the clearing where he spotted Joe squatting down and sharpening his brush hook with an oil stone. There, next to the tree, was Billy's lunchbox, brush hook, and denim jacket. He walked up to Joe. "Thanks a lot, Joe. I really appreciate it." "Nothing. Jackson no come till after 4:30. I did nothing." He put his oilstone away and turned to work. The boy wanted to say more, that Joe had to do something, but he also realized that, under the circumstances, silence was probably the smarter for now. He put his lunch, which was in a paper bag this morning, in the lunchbox and decided that he'd go up to the candy store at lunch and get them both coffee. Relieved and grateful, Billy concentrated on working hard, and as a result, the morning passed quickly. At lunchtime, he and Joe sat in the regular spot, but their conversation, usually lively and animated, was formal and somewhat cool. They made some small talk about the dredging operation, but understood that it was best that way. He knew that some time would have to pass before they could talk about it. That afternoon, whenever he took a breather, he stood and scanned the treetops intently. He saw several crows, but they were conspicuous mostly by virtue of their relative silence. At quitting time, he rushed home and found, to his relief, that Lord Byron looked fine. His grandfather called from the garage. "Well, son, he's got his appetite back. He's got a lot of spunk, too." The squirrels and the blue jays were down pestering him a couple of times, but he cawed them off. All in all, he's had a pretty quiet day. After supper, Billy went back to Lord Byron's cage, opened the wire door, and removed the bird. The crow only nipped him twice and then seemed content to remain quiet while the boy walked around the backyard, talking to him constantly. While he walked, he took the opportunity to closely examine the bird. He noticed that some of the dried blood was gone from his leg. The boy guessed that he had preened it away. When it was nearly dark, he put Lord Byron back in the cage and went inside.
This pattern was followed every day for more than a week. Work and then Lord Byron. During the days at work, Joe was still aloof and distant, but Billy let it pass. During the evenings at home, his friends were excited and interested by the crow. It was soon clear, however, that basketball at the local playground was even more interesting. Ordinarily, Billy would have agreed, but there was something about the bird and that wild look of him that fascinated him. After Lord Byron would be bedded down for the night, he would read about birds in general and crows in particular. He found out much of a scientific nature. That the crow was classified as a member of the zoological class Aves, as were all birds. That he was a member of the order Passeriformes, or perching birds, the most advanced group on the evolutionary ladder. That as one of the family Corvidae, Lord Byron was closely related to the raven, the blue jay, and the magpie. And finally, that next to the raven, the crow was our largest songbird, if their raucous call could be regarded as a song. But beyond these matters of scientific classification, Billy found out much more personal information, which amplified the remarks of his grandfather and the veterinarian. The crow was a gregarious bird and congregated in flocks. They even posted an elaborate sentry system when the group was feeding. They went so far as to expel these sentries for a poor performance. They were intelligent enough to have been trained with some success. Some had even been taught to speak a few words. They also loved brightly colored objects such as coins and yarn. There were many instances on record of such items being found in their nests. They had a number of bad habits as well, such as robbing the nests of other songbirds and pestering farmers by eating their seed crop. All of the sources that the boy read asserted the crow was one of the most interesting of birds and was a vital part of the ecology of the regions they inhabited. By the end of the second week, Lord Byron could perch quite well on the section of broom handle that Billy had rigged in the cage. He still favored the right foot a little, but it was clearly getting better. One Saturday morning, while the boy was getting the bird some fresh water, a pair of crows flew overhead, cawing loudly. Lord Byron returned the call and fluttered into the air inside the cage. the boy noticed one thing immediately. He didn't keel over and fall to the ground, but realighted gracefully. Billy had an idea. He drove downtown to the hobby shop with the bird perched on the front seat. This was the first time that Lord Byron had been in the car since he had been recovered from the woods, and he seemed to like it. Now, however, he could stand and balance himself by alternately spreading one wing or the other whenever necessary. When they got downtown, he parked the car, went into a hobby shop, and bought a spool of kite string. He drove home rapidly, explaining, as they went, his plan. He laughed out loud at himself, as if he understands, or even if he did, as if he's going to reply. When he arrived home, he quickly outlined his plan to Pepas. Not a bad idea at all, son, but go slow at first. Billy took him to the wide open turnaround area of the driveway. It was a beautiful, clear day, cool and breezy. It's perfect flying weather, Lord Byron. What do you say we give it a try? The bird looked at the boy impassively while he tied the kite string around his good leg. He was careful to make it snug, but not too tight. The crow flapped his wings several times while this was going on, but otherwise seemed content. He was perched on the first two fingers of the boy's left hand. With his right hand, he unraveled about 20 feet of the string, and after talking to him in an encouraging fashion, gently flipped his left hand skyward. Lord Byron merely gripped his fingers more tightly, flapped his wings, and cawed loudly. Come on, boy, try it. It won't hurt. Billy tried 3 or 4 more times with the same results every time. The crow was either not ready or not willing. Though a bit discouraged, he decided that it would be unwise to push the bird too hard or too fast. He undid the kite string and returned him to the cage. Pepas, who had been watching this, said, Don't be discouraged. Remember, you've been carrying him in your hands the whole time that he's been here. He needs to get used to flexing his wings when he's around you. This seemed sensible, and from that time on, Billy started to carry the crow more and more on his left hand with the kite string loosely tied around the good leg. Soon the bird was even perching on his shoulder during their evening walks, occasionally nipping the boy's ear gently. One thing had became increasingly clear. The crow had many different calls, and the raucous caw was only one of them. Lord Byron had a variety of low, guttural caws that he used in friendly situations. They also developed a game. Billy remembered from his reading that crows liked brightly colored objects, so he began putting buttons, tin foil, and yarn on the ground in front of the cage. Lord Byron would look at them for a moment, shining in the evening sun, and then pick them up and place them in a corner of the cage. One evening, Billy put some yellow yarn in his shirt pocket, letting the end of the strand hang out. Soon after Lord Byron was perched on his shoulder, he spied the yarn. He bent his head down and quickly yanked it from the pocket. The boy then took the yarn away gently and replaced it in his pocket, but with no ends showing. The crow made a quiet little caw, hopped from Billy's shoulder and into his proffered hand, poking his beak into the pocket and retrieved the yarn. They developed this game into an elaborate routine and used it often to amuse both family and friends. After about a week of increased freedom, Billy almost never held him with 2 hands anymore. He felt it was time to start the flying program again. He followed the same careful preparation as before, but this time, when he flipped his left hand into the air, Lord Byron laboriously took off, flew about 20 feet or so, suddenly skewed off wildly to the right, and came down amid awkward flapping and indignant caws. At first, the boy was frightened that he had come down too hard, but it was quickly apparent he was fine, if a bit ruffled. He picked him up and called out to his grandfather. "Did you see that, Pepos? He flew. Not very far, but he flew." "Yes, he did, son. He sure did. It won't be long now." Although Billy was elated, there was something that bothered him. He wasn't quite sure what it was, but it took the edge off his excitement. Lord Byron was definitely bigger now, and his eyes were clear and bright. It seemed that he liked his cage less and less. One of the reasons for this was called to the boy's attention by his grandfather. The squirrels had devised an ingenious method in order to harass Lord Byron. They knew they couldn't get very close to the cage because the crow was very effective with his beak lately, and it seemed by plan they had taken to dropping acorns from the branches of the oak tree onto the tabletop, which served as the roof of the cage. Being dropped from 25 or 30 feet, the acorns made a terrific wreck. The crow didn't like it one bit and cawed loudly. There wasn't much they could do about the situation short of shooting the squirrels, and they weren't about to do that. Besides, the squirrels only did it occasionally. The flying lessons continued each evening, and the improvement was both evident and remarkable. Billy was letting out about 50 feet of string now, and Lord Byron would fly around him like an extremely maneuverable fighter plane. He didn't keel over or skew off to one side anymore. During these moments, the boy felt exalted, for he could feel the soar through the string and had a real sense of the power and freedom of flight. It was increasingly clear that, for all intents and purposes, the concussion was healed. The doctor was right. It had just been a matter of time. Billy thought of this statement more and more as the summer wore into August. There was less than 2 weeks' work left clearing the woods along the easement, and he would be quitting work soon in order to get ready to go away to college. It was obvious that the crow couldn't stay. Not that it was at all clear he wanted to. His parents would be returning very soon, and his grandparents had enough to do without a crow. He tried to dismiss these thoughts from his mind, for in the weeks that he cared for the crow, he had grown terribly attached to him. He had developed a great respect for his intelligence and beauty. The boy and the bird went everywhere together. One of Lord Byron's favorite treats was still the car ride, but it was also becoming more and more obvious that flying was what appealed to him most. At work, Billy and Joe were on good terms again and talked about the sorts of things they had always, but not surprisingly, the subject of crows had not come up. Friday at lunch, however, the boy mentioned Lord Byron and, as Joe didn't object, went on to describe all that happened since the day when they had their confrontation over the fledgling. Joe seemed surprised at all the things the crow could do, but if he didn't believe any of it, he didn't let it be shown. At the conclusion of the story, however, he asked, with characteristic bluntness, "Well, what are you going to do with it?" "I don't know, Joe. I guess I'm going to have to let him go. It'll be hard, but I can't think of anything else to do." "Well, I told you it'd be nothing but trouble." Joe stuffed the wrapping papers and scrapes into his lunchbox. Billy knew that this wasn't really a criticism. Joe had been through so much suffering that he felt he had to be very careful about making emotional investments in people or things because, in the past, so many of those investments had been destroyed. Billy recognized he was cautioning against risking being hurt. He also knew intuitively that, while the occasion was a hurt crow, the real significance of the event went far beyond that. He knew the experience was somehow a very important one that said a great deal about the way one approached the world. That evening he flew the bird again, and Lord Byron made it obvious that he could fly perfectly well and that he was resenting the restraints imposed by his teacher. They played their games again, and in the case of the brightly colored yarn, His skill was such that Billy could not fool him no matter what pocket of his shirt or jeans he put the yarn in. They went for a ride in the car and drove down to the basketball court near the municipal swimming pool where he knew his friends would be. He often did this and showed off Lord Byron's skills to the genuine amusement of everyone. After this evening's performance, about 6 of them sat around talking. Most of the talk was about quitting summer jobs and college. The whole group was beginning college in the fall, and they recognized, in their various ways, that this signaled the end of something old and the beginning of something new. Most of them were going away to school, and the schools were located all over the country. "When are you going to quit work, Billy?" asked Tim McBride, who had just told everyone he would be finished in 2 more days. "Next week, I guess." Chris Garrett turned to him. "Hey, Billy, what are you going to do with that bird?" gesturing towards Lord Byron, who was perched on the boy's shoulder. "I don't imagine that they'll take too kindly to a crow in the dormitories." Everyone laughed when Charlie Evans broke in. "No way. They'll already have enough birds there already." Billy felt a twinge behind his laughter. He knew the question was friendly, and he knew it was the logical one, action on which would be required soon. "I guess I'm going to have to let him go. He's okay now. The foot's healed, and he flies, well, like a bird." They smiled sympathetically. They all knew how much the crow meant to him. Chris said, "Well, it'll hurt for a while, but it's probably for the best. He's sure a pretty bird, real smart, too." Lord Byron had been looking from boy to boy during the conversation as if he understood everything that was said. "Wouldn't a zoo or something want him?" asked Charlie. "That way you could get to see him whenever you wanted." "Maybe, but somehow that wouldn't be right. You know, one cage for another." "If I'm going to let him go, I might as well make it where I found him. There's some question, according to the authorities, about whether or not the flock will take him back, but I figure it's worth the risk. Besides, if he's going to be a loner, I feel he'd rather be a loner in the woods. I know I'd rather be." They all nodded agreement. In a little while, the group broke up to a chorus of "See you tomorrows." It was nearly dark. Billy and Chris walked to the parking lot together. When they got to the car, Chris said, "Don't worry about Lord Byron. He'll be fine. I know that doesn't help you too much, but he'll be okay, and that's what counts." "Yes, you're right. Good night. See you tomorrow." He opened the door and placed Lord Byron on the back of the front seat. He made several low caws as he steadied his position. The street light was on, and his bright eyes shone in the soft glare. He was now about full grown and had developed into a truly beautiful bird. The black feathers gleamed as he moved slightly, and his fine, intelligent head was cocked to one side as he looked quizzically. He was moved by the beauty of the bird once again. He plucked gently at him and stroked the soft feathers at the base of his skull. After a moment, he took a deep breath and started the car. It was just a matter of time, he thought sadly, and drove home.
Just how little time was brought home forcibly to him several mornings later at work. It was clear that he and Joe had nearly finished the work that they had set out to do nearly 2 months earlier. During the coffee break, the foreman told them that they would be shifted to another job in the stone quarry up in Totowa. Billy heard the news with a sinking heart. So soon? That only leaves me 3 days, he thought, if I am to release him while I'm still working in this area. He recognized that he could bring the bird here any time, but he also knew at the same time that such a postponement wouldn't make the inevitable separation any easier. After work, he went home and over dinner told his grandparents what he had decided to do. There was silence until his grandmother spoke. "Well, Billy, you never mind. If it has to be, you'll just have to make do. You saved his life, and he's a fine, strong bird now. It's always hard to let go, but it will be for the best. You'll see." She got up quickly from the table and busied herself with the dishes. Papas only nodded. Later, however, out in the backyard, he said, "When exactly are you going to release him?" "The day after tomorrow, I guess." "Okay, son. Only remember that prolonging it isn't going to help any." He turned and went in the house. Billy spent a long time fooling around with Lord Byron, and finally, well after dark, he put the crow back in the cage and went in. His grandfather was watching a night game between the White Sox and the Yankees, and the boy sat down and pretended to watch. Both the boy and the man were avid baseball fans, and ordinarily they would have had a lively discussion about the game, but not tonight. He couldn't concentrate at all and only responded automatically to what few comments his sympathetic grandfather made. By 10:30, Billy could no longer pretend any interest in the game. Saying that he was tired, he said goodnight and went upstairs to bed. Not so surprisingly, he was nearly as tired as he said, and despite his upset and concern about the next day, he soon fell asleep. He came awake quickly in the rainy, wet dawn. He looked at his watch, saw it was only 6:15, and tried to roll over and go back to sleep, but that was useless and he knew why. It might as well be this morning, he thought. It's a lousy day out. He got up, washed, shaved, and dressed quickly and was downstairs by 6:30. He nearly beat his grandmother to the kitchen, which would have been truly remarkable. Both of his grandparents lived by the adage about early to bed, early to rise. Mama, of course, knew why the boy was up so early, but did nothing more than ask what he wanted for breakfast. "Eggs and bacon will be fine," he responded without enthusiasm. He went out to the backyard while the food was cooking. Lord Byron uttered several low croaks of greeting while Billy fed him. He marveled again at the bird's beauty, the fine, intelligent head, the bright eyes, the glossy plumage. He regarded him with a great joy, all the greater for it was mingled with a sense of loss. He stroked the sleek feathers and then placed him back in the cage. "Today's the day, my friend." He got up and went into the house. He ate his breakfast quietly and quickly. His grandparents said nothing, though he was aware that they were exchanging glances. He checked the clock over the stove, 7:15. "I'll leave now," he thought. "That way I'll have about a half hour before work starts." He stood up and said, "Mame, Pape, I'm going to let Lord Byron go this morning. It's best that way." Startled by the break in his voice, he turned away quickly and walked out to the backyard. Aware that they were both watching him from the kitchen, Billy started the car, turned it around hurriedly, and, leaving the engine running, got out and took the crow from the cage. After placing him on the front seat, he got back in and drove off. As they went along, the bird clucked and hopped along the back of the seat more cheerfully than usual, or so it seemed to Billy. Soon they arrived at the job site. The rain had subsided to a mist, but everything was soaked, and the heavy clouds promised that there was more rain to come. He wished for a downpour. Not because he was lazy, but because he knew that in the event of heavy rain, they would be working back at the maintenance shed, and he would be therefore far away from the site of the release. He took Lord Byron out of the car and walked towards the woods. The bird was quiet, as if appraising the area. Billy talked rapidly and softly to him. "I love you, Lord Byron, but it's best for you, now that you're well and strong, that you get out of the cage and back to the free air where you belong." The crow croaked softly, cocking his head to one side and watching as if he understood. Billy knew that he was going to cry and didn't care. Pointing toward the wooded area where the crow had been found and beyond which the fields and hedgerows stretched, he said, "I'm going to let you go now. God bless you. Goodbye." With that, he made a sharp, sweeping gesture of his left hand. Lord Byron flew off, quickly aware that there was no kite string restraining him. He flapped and cawed in larger and larger circles. The rain began to fall heavily. The bird made a final turn and flew straight back toward the boy and landed next to him on the gravel shoulder of the road. Billy was crying hard now. His sense of purpose was rapidly dissolving. He thought wildly for a moment, "The hell with it, I'll bring him home." He knew immediately, however, that was impossible. He wiped his eyes with the back of his right hand, stooped, and picked up the waiting bird. The release procedure was repeated again, but this time the boy turned and walked to the car. Lord Byron, apparently realizing the expanding possibilities of free flight more and more with each passing moment, inscribed larger and more erratic circles, towering and swooping. He finally skimmed to the branch of a large red oak about 150 yards across the clearing. Billy, still crying freely, started the car and turned back toward the maintenance shed, where the rain would force the day's work to take place. It was only 10 minutes of 8. He had time to compose himself. The morning passed quickly, considering his state of mind. The foreman had him help the head mechanic who was overhauling a Jeep engine. It was interesting work and required concentration. It was a welcome distraction. When the noon whistle blew, Billy washed up, got his lunch from the car, and went to the back of the shed after casting a look in the direction of the woods. He sat down next to Joe. It was hot and steamy in the shed, and they both ate in silence. While he was pouring his coffee, he was aware that Joe was watching him. "How's the bird, Beely?" "I let him go this morning. It was the only thing to do. He's better off now, and besides, the summer is nearly over." He stopped and looked away because he could feel himself filling up. Joe grunted and drank some coffee. "You got pain, huh? See, I tell you, it's no good getting messed up with things. Everything gotta go in time." Billy kept quiet. Joe said no more. That afternoon, his mind was a confused welter of ideas and indecisions. About 3 o'clock, Jackson told Joe and Billy that they were being sent to the stone quarry up in Totowa the next morning. The woods were ready enough for the dredge, he explained, and the company needed crushed stone for another job in Rockland County. At first, the boy wanted to protest, but he quickly recognized that this was a blessing in disguise. By quitting time, the sun was out. On his way home, he stopped his car by the woods. He got out and walked down the incline, hoping and not hoping to see Lord Byron. After covering about 50 yards, he saw, through a break in the trees, but at a considerable distance, a lone crow that he was sure was Lord Byron. He was high up in an oak. He watched for a long moment and turned back to the car. He drove home quickly. As soon as he pulled into the backyard, he saw that his grandfather had taken the cage down and no evidence of it remained beneath the tree. He went into the house, said hello briefly, and went upstairs to shower. Dinner passed with very little conversation. After excusing himself, Billy went out into the backyard and washed his car. It looked as if the storm had passed and the sky was cloudless in the west. When he was finished and was hanging the wet towels on the line to dry, he was startled by his grandfather's voice. "Lord Byron's let go?" "Yes, Pate." "That was a hard thing to do." "Yes, he came back the first time." "And that just made it harder?" "It sure did. I'll never forget him, but it really hurt. Maybe Joe was right." His voice started to break. He turned away. "What do you mean, maybe Joe was right?" Billy told him what Joe had said at lunch. Papa said nothing for a moment, and then said slowly, "It's a point all right, Billy, but I think he's dead wrong." "Why?" He turned around. Pepas looked at him for what seemed a long while, and then spoke as if he was choosing his words carefully. "Look, son, loving anything in this world means getting attached to it, and getting attached to anything means taking a risk, the risk of losing it. But that's not an argument against loving something, because the beauty of love, somehow, depends on knowing it's not forever." He was silent for a moment. "Your grandmother and me got attached to the bird too. He was a lovely thing, and you did the right thing by him. And you know, the beautiful thing is that it will last, because you'll never forget it, and we'll never forget it." He coughed and then put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're a good boy, Billy." He blushed and lowered his head. Pepas turned and walked back to the house. He stood for a long time, and then went up to the woods behind the garage. He sat on a split rail fence in the waning light and thought of Lord Byron and what his grandfather had said. In a while, he felt somewhat better. The ache was still there, but so was the experience of the bird's beauty. That would stay. It was just a matter of time.